Okay, can you guys see the PowerPoint and see me on the screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. So it's a very broad topic. As we all know, China is not homogeneous, and business in China can mean almost anything. You could be importing or sourcing white label products from China to sell on Amazon. You could be doing cross-border e-commerce to sell products to Chinese consumers. You could be assigned to live and work in China as an expat, or you can be what Miles is doing, teaching Chinese to Americans or Westerners. So there's no one size fits all. And it's such a broad topic, I decided to uh, do a slight twist. Oh, there we go. Now my video is working. I decided to do a slight twist. I'm going to try to help people understand how to do business in China by debunking some of what I think are China myths. All right. So, first of all, how many of you speak Chinese? Now, so assuming that you actually don't speak Chinese, I would tell you that I have some good news for you. Okay. I'm sure you've all heard somebody say language is the gateway to another culture. So if you've heard that before, can you raise your hand? Language is a gateway to another culture. Anybody heard that? So um, they say language is a gateway to another culture, but as far as doing business in China, this is what I say. I say knowing how to speak Chinese doesn't mean you know what to say in Chinese. And Michael and I have had a lot of offline discussions where his Chinese is quite good, but his cultural understanding uh, could improve in certain areas to help him actually achieve a better outcome. Now, they also say walking in another man's shoes will unlock some mystical sway doing business across cultures, or in this case, with Chinese partners and employees. Has anybody heard that doing business across cultures, you have to learn how to walk in another man's shoes? Has anybody heard that before? Okay, that's a very typical kind of intercultural, cross-cultural thing. Walking in another man's shoes will unlock some improvement in how you communicate. They also say, and I actually, I asked ChatGPT and Bard about doing business across cultures and do business in China. And one of the answers that always comes up is adapting to different communication styles. So they say adapting to different communication styles will somehow empower you to negotiate and lead more effectively in China. Okay, so the question that I'm going to answer to that is, first of all, are they right? And then second of all, which is I want the question for you guys to answer, is who are they? Because a lot of people say it, but the question is, who are they? All right. Now, our mission today, our China mission today is we're going to try to start to develop what I call a mindset for China business. We're going to do self-introduction rituals because what I believe is understanding 自我介绍, the self-introduction ritual in Chinese culture will open more doors in China than just speaking Chinese. All right. We're going to talk about cultural dichotomies because I believe understanding Chinese cultural dichotomies with the West will actually show you how to walk further in China in your own shoes, as opposed to learning what it feels like to walk in somebody else's shoes. All right. And then we're going to get into some art of war tactics that I believe is even more important than communication styles, and it'll empower you to communicate, negotiate, and lead more effectively in China. All right. And work with your Chinese counterparts more constructively. So to get started, I'm going to begin. Okay. I'm going to do my self-introduction, 我的自我介绍. All right. And understanding the purpose of this is to provide background information or 背景 that is essential to deepening Guanxi. All right. So first of all, I was born and raised in America. I was actually born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. When I grew up in the South, when I played sports, I was the only ethnically Asian person on the team, whether it was soccer, whether it was football, whether it was baseball. You can see that I was the only ethnically Asian person or Chinese person. So my thinking and my experience growing up is completely quote unquote American. Now, I met my wife in the United States, and you can see we got married at the DeKalb County Courthouse, but she is originally from a very small province in Hunan. So she has a very, very traditional Chinese mindset. And I currently have a son. You may even hear him crying in the background, who's 3.5 years old. He's the next generation American-born Chinese. He was born in Irvine, California. Now, if I was introducing myself to someone Chinese or someone in China, I would talk about my native place. In Chinese, it's 我的老家. And the first thing I would say is 我老家是江苏淮安. Because when Chinese people meet each other in China, the first question they ask is 你老家在哪? Okay, that's the first question they ask. They want to know, what is your native place? What is your hometown? So I would say 我老家是江苏淮安, and then I would add 周恩来的老家. It's the same hometown as the first premier of the People's Republic of China. Now, my relevant credentials for why we're here today. So this session is a doing business in China kind of event. So what are my relevant credentials? So I started my first experience overseas in 1996. I was a country manager in Taiwan. For 12 years between 2004 and 2016, I was a China expat. I was an entrepreneur in China. I was an instructor. I taught at local universities. I was a consultant. I worked at state-owned enterprises and multinational companies in China. And I was also an advisor and a coach. And more recently, I'm an author. Okay, I published The Chinese Honeymoon Period, which, Miles, you should have gotten a free download link for that. Well, you registered on Meetup, so you'll have to DM me somewhere, and I'll give you the link to download a free copy of The Chinese Honeymoon Period, which is my book. I've also published a course called Solving China's Unknown Unknowns, everything we know about China and do's and don'ts for winning negotiations in China. And my next book is called Exactly What to Say in China. So a lot of the things that I teach are kind of based on that. Now, the self-introduction rituals that I think are the gateway to doing business more successfully in China, there's a lot of possibilities, okay? As a business person working in China, the most common one is a paratrooper manager, okay? In Chinese, paratrooper manager is 空降部队. Now, normally in my Chinese cultural and language immersion events, I don't put the Chinese up and I just ask the participants to say them, but this is more for a non-Chinese speaking audience. So that's why it's going a little bit differently, as Michael can attest. So 空降部队, paratrooper manager, metaphorically describes how Chinese people feel about China expats. Foreigners that are assigned to live and work in China, that they're just dropped in. They may or may not speak Chinese. They definitely are not familiar with how things work in China. Often they have translators. There's a lot of negative sentiments that those managers are never aware of because of the Chinese culture of giving face. Now, there are personal introductions, one-on-one, broadcast introductions, which is what I just did. There are ceremonial introductions, like when you kick off a new business. There are reintroductions, like if you're working in China, you get promoted, you may get reintroduced as the new head of R&D or the new head of marketing or the new China country manager or whatever, and you have to reintroduce yourself. Those are all opportunities to do Chinese self-introductions. But the main one is Guanxi. Okay, I'm sure you all heard this term. I'm sure you all have an idea what it means. It's when somebody makes a referral to you to make a connection with someone else. And how do you 自我介绍? Okay, so the key is really having a little bit of situational awareness. So the key is to always be aware of what the context of the situation is and the perception you want to create in order to be perceived as someone who is advantageous to deepen Guanxi with. This is the goal during every self-introduction. All right, and I've created a little bit of a scorecard. So you want to show relevant credentials. So I try to briefly introduce why I'm kind of qualified to tell people how to do business in China. You want to talk about your native place. You want to get as personal as possible. Chinese people love personal details, your status, your marriage, your family. I think when Angela was doing business in China, they always wanted to know if she was married or single, because if you're single, they will always try to introduce someone to you. Maybe insights into your interests and hobbies. And of course, you want to try to be interesting, likable, funny, the standard stuff. But the goal is to be as personal as possible to help your Chinese counterpart discover opportunities to make connections in order to deepen Guanxi. All right. So now this is where the participation begins. Okay. So what we do here, Miles, if you don't mind, is Michael knows this. I always give some very honest feedback. And it's to help you accelerate kind of your cultural awareness when you're actually speaking Chinese to Chinese people. So first of all, your Chinese pronunciation is excellent. And your understanding of Chinese kind of face-giving pleasantries is also excellent. All of these things were perfect. Now, the context of the situation is you have an opportunity to potentially work with a couple of Chinese business people to help promote your language training platform, software course, whatever it is. So one of the things that was lacking is specifics. So the Chinese business person would be very interested in how long you have been teaching Chinese, what formal education you have. Chinese people are crazy about your HSK, whatever level you have, whatever certificate to teach, what universities or organizations have you taught before. All of that is important. So from a business standpoint, they want to know what qualifies you, what are your credentials. So if it's a business conversation, as opposed to just a friendly introduction, you always have to keep in mind that aspect of it. And there's another aspect is Chinese people really, really curious about personal things. So if you've lived in China, they want to know where. If you've worked in China, they want to know where. If you have a Chinese girlfriend, they want to know that. If you're single, they want to know that. They want to know exactly where you were born, because let's just say you were born in San Francisco. The Chinese gentleman on the other side may have business interests in San Francisco. They may have investments in San Francisco. They may have a niece that's going to school in San Francisco. Those kind of possibilities for connections are invaluable if you want to take the opportunity of a 自我介绍 and find connections to create opportunities to deepen Guanxi.
Thank you.
All right. The next thing we're going to talk about is Chinese cultural dichotomies with the West. And the first one is about the law, rights, people's rights, human rights. So from a business perspective, or like if you're just living and working in China, there's a way for me to kind of categorize the differences. And it goes like this. In China or in the West, people are taught or conditioned to obey the law. All right. So if you grew up here, you don't, I even tell my son, don't poo-poo in the pool, the police will come and put you in jail. Okay. That's what we teach our kids. So we're conditioned and we're taught to obey the law. Okay. It doesn't mean that everybody obeys the law. Doesn't mean that our government officials aren't corrupt in a lot of ways, but generally speaking, the majority of the people are taught to obey the law. In China, people are conditioned to obey people, which essentially means it's almost irrelevant what the law says, because traditionally in China, as long as you have the right Guanxi, it really doesn't matter what you did. The good news is a lot of that is trending in a more positive direction. Some of these stories that happened 10 or 15 years ago probably aren't happening quite as frequently now. But this is the mindset difference. In the West, people are taught to obey the law. In China, people have been conditioned to obey other people. Guanxi is, the literal translation is a relation or relationship. And this is, again, participation. So, Michael, how would you translate Guanxi? 利益 describes the personal benefit that you believe you have in a relationship or from a relationship. 诚意 is what you give each other in reciprocity to deepen 关系. So that's a little bit of that's the little bit of the difference. Now the third question for Guanxi is, from your American perspective, what is complicated, challenging, or frustrating about this concept of deepening Guanxi? So the way I describe Guanxi and how it works in China is I try to use a metaphor. And so I say the Guanxi engine runs everything in China, business and personal relationships. And there are three pillars or three components that make the Guanxi engine run. The first one is face, and you mentioned that, Michael. It's basically the lubricant that keeps the parts of the engine lubricated. It's 面子, all right? The other is what we just talked about, goodwill, 诚意. That is actually the fuel or the steam that keeps the engine running. You use the metaphor of a bank account where you would have to, keep your currency roughly in balance. That means you want to receive as much goodwill as you give. You don't want it to be out of balance, because Guanxi is the continuous exchange of reciprocity and goodwill. And the third pillar is the 利益, what you just talked about, the outcomes. These would be the destinations that you actually reach, or the Guanxi engine will enable you to achieve, to reach. These are the outcomes, the personal benefits. This is the metaphorical Guanxi engine that I believe answers that first question. How do you translate Guanxi? Well, I wouldn't translate it. I would explain what it means through this metaphor of the Guanxi engine. Now, as far as dichotomies go, obviously we know that Guanxi is a dichotomy or relation or relationships. What they actually mean in business or personal is different. So there are a lot of contrast there. But specifically for business, there's another cultural dichotomy, and this is for negotiations. So in your case, Michael, every interview is a negotiations, right? Eventually, if they want to make you an offer, you're going to be negotiating, okay? If you're doing business in China and you're working with partners, you will have a period of negotiation. So I'm going to contrast what is the biggest difference between how we as Americans think of negotiations and most Chinese people, how they typically think of negotiating. So when you start a negotiations, other than a job interview, but even if it's a job interview, so that the outcome that you're hoping for if you are negotiating for a job interview is to get a job offer, right?
Right.
Most Westerners believe when they start negotiations, the end goal is to get a contract signed or a 合同, okay? If you're interviewing, the outcome would be an offer letter, which is also a contract. And the problem is, for cooperation, most Westerners believe that once the contract is signed, the negotiation is over. In your case, once the offer letter is received, then there's nothing else left to negotiate, right? And the contrast is, during this period is what I call the Chinese honeymoon period. Because before that contract is signed, everybody is putting forward their best face, okay? 诚意, 面子, 利益. This is what's going on as two sides are negotiating or interviewing each other or whatever it is. In contrast, Chinese people don't actually start negotiating until after the contract is signed, which means their expectations change after the contract is signed because now they feel you have a Guanxi connection and their expectations change. So for Chinese people, this process of giving face and exchanging goodwill and the Guanxi engine, it doesn't end when the contract is signed. It continues in perpetuity. And this is what Chinese people mean when they say 双赢 or win-win. They want to continue that exchange, or ultimately they are gaining more personal benefits, which is 利益. So even if a Chinese employer hires you, they will still want to deepen Guanxi with you ongoing because they feel you will become more loyal. You will be more incentivized to work harder, whatever it is. All right. Now, what happens is most Westerners stop negotiating after the contract is signed, which is why bad things start to happen in a business relationship. Okay. This is also in the book. I call it goodwill extraction, is when your Chinese counterpart is no longer getting the goodwill, face, and li'i benefits from you because the contract has already been signed. They will start to try to find these benefits in other parts of the value chain, which is why I call it goodwill extraction. They extract it from other parts of the Chinese value chain, which they know much better than you. And then what we do as Americans or Westerners is we interpret that as bad behavior. But it didn't have to be that way. The problem is we stop negotiating. And that is the difference. Now, what happens once we stop negotiating? Well, unfortunately, what you're going to continue to receive is 表面功夫. Okay. If you know this term, 表面功夫means acting to deceive. They're putting on a show. They're telling you what they think you want to hear, but behind your back, they're doing something else. It's called 表面功夫. All right. Now, during the Chinese honeymoon period, you're also receiving 表面功夫, but it's a more positive 表面功夫. Whereas when you stop exchanging goodwill, giving face, and reciprocity, they start acting to deceive you. It's called 表面功夫. During the honeymoon period, they're giving you 表面功夫, but they're acting to endear themselves to you. So there's a negative 表面功夫, and there is a positive 表面功夫. This is the cultural dichotomy of negotiations between Westerners and Chinese people. All right. I hope this kind of puts some of what you're doing, because you're negotiating with Chinese people all the time, into context.
Makes sense.
And it'll help you understand how their attitudes and their expectations and their behavior changes at certain stages of the relationship. Another cultural dichotomy is time. All right. So most Westerners think of time as linear. Time will tell us when and tell us where. The problem is it doesn't tell us how, and it doesn't tell us why. If you've ever had a conversation with somebody who doesn't understand finance, there's a time value of money, and people who understand finance, when they're talking with non-financial people, it's difficult because they don't understand net present value and the time value of money. Okay. Finance in Chinese is 财务. There's also emotional time. How much patience do you have? 耐心. There's also psychological time, which is how long should we wait for something? How long should something be? 多久? All right. There's relative time. This is the biggest frustration for most Westerners is 为了谁? So if Chinese people are talking with the CEO or the president of the company and they have a meeting, they will always be punctual or early. If they are meeting their friends, and more importantly, if they're meeting their relatives, they will always be late because relative time.
I was going to say,
Sometimes
is that why it's called relative time?
it's both. It's both. So the difference is, how do you value your personal time? Do you want to be early? Do you want to be punctual? Do you want to arrive late? So for me, I've been conditioned on Lombardi time because I played sports all growing up in the United States. That means no matter when the meeting is, I'm always going to show up 15 minutes early. Okay. Doesn't matter if I know you or not, I will not be late. Okay. That's different than a lot of friends, relatives that I have in China. Completely different. And the question that you have to ask yourself is, do you exchange money for time, or do you exchange time for money? And China time, which we say moves very fast, as far as a cultural dichotomy, is just when everything feels uncomfortable. That can be referred to as China time. And the question that you always need to ask yourself is, are you curious why Chinese behave this way? Or are you more likely to complain, why can't they behave more like this? And that is the attitude that often gets a lot of Westerners in trouble when they're trying to continue their relationships and deepen their Guanxi in perpetuity. Generally speaking, Westerners believe our time is our most valuable commodity. But when you're doing business in China, I say this mindset affects your attitude and your approach, and it becomes a disadvantage. Now, have you seen this before, Michael? Okay. So, and I'm going to tell you why. Because when we think time is our most valuable commodity, our counterpart in China thinks this. Can you read that?
我有的是时间。
Exactly. I have all the time in the world. The typical negotiations with China, and why Westerners, foreigners in China typically get so impatient and they can't seem to get a straight answer, and Chinese people feel non-committal, is because, well, 我有的是时间. But for the Westerners, time is money. Westerners say that all the time. So time is a cultural dichotomy. And if you don't understand it and you don't know how to deal with it, then you're creating a disadvantage for yourself. It actually becomes where you're almost like a puppet. Chinese people are manipulating you, sometimes unintentionally and subconsciously, because they're following one process where they don't really care about time, and you're following another process where I have to get this done. All right. So puppet is 傀儡. Now, as far as art of war tactics, time becomes one of their weapons. They're being your counterpart in China during negotiations, even in a job interview. Okay. 时间观念不一样. And when you get frustrated, it also becomes a weapon that they can utilize to their advantage, because you will likely compromise more when you're frustrated because you're trying to meet a deadline. Okay. And when you're frustrated, you're likely to act emotionally instead of rationally. 因为你被激怒了. All right. And the final weapon that they use, that I didn't really explain as a dichotomy, is they're deliberately vague or deliberately ambiguous. You can see that in our geopolitics, where the Chinese leadership will make some assertion, but it'll just be completely ambiguous. And it actually, from an American standpoint, it doesn't really say anything, doesn't commit to anything actionable or measurable. It's ambiguous. And we get very frustrated. 故意不清不楚, deliberately unclear about what they really want to do or what their real bottom line is. Okay. So the thing to understand when you're doing business in China is these tactics are instinctual. They arise from just Chinese culture. Oftentimes they're subconscious and they're not deliberate. And I put that not deliberate, I highlighted that because I don't want anybody to be judgmental when Chinese people are ambiguous. It's cultural. I don't want you to be judgmental when Chinese people are late. It's cultural. It's not personal. All right. So the way to counter these types of behaviors, especially if you're in negotiations, is you have to be vague intentionally. Because only when you're vague will you compel the other side to actually take action. Okay. I've heard a lot of people say, well, if you're looking for a partner in China, you want to make sure they share similar values with you. Then they'll be a good partner. I completely disagree with that. It's not about values, because you'll never find a partner in China that actually shares your values. You'll only find a partner in China that can do the 表面功夫 to pretend and convince you that they share your values. Actually, what you want to do is you want to find a partner that you can deepen Guanxi with, and you want to align on process, not align on values. Process moves things forward. Values has no meaning across cultural differences and cultural dichotomies. All right. Intentionally vague is 不清不楚. You also want to learn to be deliberately silent. One of the things Westerners struggle with is they don't like awkward silence, so they will speak when people aren't talking. They'll say something. But being silent in a negotiations in China will create an advantage, and it will also reduce the likelihood of circular conversations. Okay. Silent is 无语. Learn to just be deliberately silent. Practice being deliberately silent. It's okay to be silent during negotiations. And then, of course, giving faces, you want to kind of, they're acting to deceive or acting to endear. Literally, it's quite disingenuous, but culturally, it's just how they behave. For you to be successful in business in China, you have to learn to act surprised pleasantly, because that's how you give face and strengthen Guanxi and trust with the person you're trying to create a partnership with. All right. I think we talked about this before. In Chinese, it's 惊喜. All right. So there are many cultural dichotomies. I talk about a lot of these in the book, The Chinese Honeymoon Period. And we'll go into more detail about these in my next book, Exactly What to Say in China.